based on the latest news that China and the United States agreed on Thursday to hold more trade talks in hopes of breaking an impasse over tariffs and global supplies. Now consider this. This is going to be a major milestone for both countries. And given the fact not only we're seeing this ongoing political and also this economic competition between the two countries, and at the same time, more countries, specifically in Southeast Asia, are rather concerned about the outcome of the competition. And for example, the nation of Vietnam, based on the media, that Vietnam is to believe that it is getting tired of, air quote, squeezed by the competition between the two countries. How do we understand the progress within the talk? And also on June 9th, the representatives from both countries are going to meet in London, start the second round of the conversation. Is the conversation going to be productive? And how do we understand that at this moment, both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump are ready to negotiate, especially we talk about the future for both countries? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker. Again, if you follow our show closely, you must know Dr. Michael Patrick. Dr. Patrick covered news extensively, especially from international perspective. And when we talk about international news and international aspects, and Dr. Patrick always has a lot more insight to share with us. Well, Michael, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you, Will. Thank you for having me. I always enjoy hearing what you have to say because you stand in a position of being able to provide a perspective that no one else does. And I really do appreciate your comments and inviting me on the program.
Absolutely, Michael. Again, let's get started. Now, on June 9th in London, there's going to be a second round of the conversation between the officials or delegates from China and also from the US. This is crucial and also extremely critical at this moment. Now, follow the social media post from sitting US President Donald Trump, and this is what he posted, and I quote, "I just concluded a very good phone call with President Xi of China, discussing some of the intricacy of a recently made and agreed to trade deal," and he added, "resulted in a very positive conclusion for both countries," end quote. Michael, from your perspective, I remember last time when you and we had a conversation, potentially there's going to be a good possibility that for Xi Jinping to sit down with Donald Trump in order to solve some of the disputable issues. But right now, for the second round of the talk, how significant is the matter at this moment? And also, after the phone call between the two leaders, why do you think that both the delegates from both countries are willing to meet, and what can we expect from the conversations?
Well, I think this is a fascinating up and down trail from Trump seeing how far he could push it, and the up and down as if two adversaries meeting on the field and sizing each other up. We start out with Trump laying down some ridiculously high tariffs, and President Xi meeting them, and they're going up the ladder and then down the ladder, checking each other out, feeling the turf. And I think both showing themselves well. I think President Xi was not about ready to let time go by before he responded to Trump's challenge. And I thought that was the way both leaders brought it to an equitable kind of posture before pressing pause for 90 days. I think was a good sign. I think just what they've been through and kind of getting used to each other as to what we're going to be doing here. I think now we're going to see some groundwork being laid. Certainly, both parties have a significant interest in seeing this come out constructively, and I think it will. I think, though, that Xi is not about ready to be bullied into submission, and I think he represented China's interest very well in this. So it's going to be interesting to see how they come through with these meetings in London. I expect to see at least some modest progress, but it will take the full 90 days. I don't think we're going to see some instant agreement here other than to keep talking.
Michael, on one hand, again, this is not the first time for President Trump to deal with Xi Jinping, especially when we talk about this ongoing political and also this economic competition. But experts believe that both countries should enhance their exchanges in diplomacy, economics, military, and other fields. Now, let's talk about diplomacy for a second. I would say during the President Trump's first term, China rolled out this what we called wolf warrior diplomacy. So in other words, China was not the ball where the ping pong ball was ready to be pushed around. But meanwhile, as the new kid on the block, and President Trump was also nervous about the exchange with China. But this is the second term. Michael, from your perspective, how should we understand the word diplomacy at this moment? And so, in other words, the conversation you and we had before are we seeing a diplomatic relationship between Trump and Xi at this moment? Or this is more than a diplomacy talk, or this is more than just a diplomatic relationship. So in other words, President Trump is looking, or both leaders are seeking something beyond the diplomacy. What do you think of that?
Well, I agree that there's a lot of diplomacy at work, but in diplomacy, sometimes people presume that means that everybody's nice all the time, that nobody speaks frankly or acts clearly. And I think when you saw the Secretary of Defense talk about Taiwan in a frank and clear way, it actually, whether or not that's an agreement is not the point, is that, okay, finally we're going to say what we mean compared to, say, during the Biden administration. So, I'm not a big believer that diplomats solve problems. I think frank, clear, authentic conversation between leaders, and these are not leaders that are accidental. In other words, they're in power because actually they have a lot in common in terms of the way in which they govern, the way in which they approach problems straight on. So this frank exchange of views in a non-hostile environment can be very constructive. So I expect to see some progress here. The military front is one that is that both sides have issues on. Whether or not we'll hear anything about that this time around, we probably won't. But I think it's going to be focused on the tariff issues. But I watched this and I heard how Trump here dinged Hollywood with some tariff situations, and at the same time, China also said we're going to be cutting back on American films. And I thought, if you're in the film industry, none of this is good news for you. You're getting caught in the crossfire from both sides. But I like the frank conversation, and especially among people, I think, who can handle that, and that's these two leaders. So I expect something constructive, but not a lot immediately. They're going to take their time, and they're going to play. They're going to play multiple cards here. They're not going to simply dump it all out on the pavement the first conversation. But it needed to move beyond the kind of wishy-washy diplomatic stage where everybody was kind of hiding, not putting all their cards on the table. We saw through the up and down horse trading of tariffs that they were both willing to put some cards on the table. And while they're not going to show it all, I think we're going to see a much healthier relationship develop.
Michael, another aspect that I would love to hear your insights, it's regarding what we called a rare earth elements. And of course, that this is something that President Trump also mentioned to President Xi Jinping during the conversation, and especially that after the conversation report came out, and it says that China has said the rare earth export controls apply to all countries, meaning it can argue that the controls should not be regarded as a countermeasure against the U.S. Michael, we know that today, when we look at the opportunities for US and China, it's more than just trade. And both countries are very much interested in developing and also accumulating this rare earth export control at this moment. So from your perspective, why is that, or why was that included in the conversation? What was President Trump trying to accomplish by mentioning or even bringing up this perspective?
He was being out front with U.S. interests. I mean, China is the leader who really sets the tone and the pace in rare earth minerals and other kinds of resources internationally. They're in control of a great deal of it, which has a lot to do with development and industry in the United States. The U.S. would like to someday be much more independent in terms of its development, but it's a ways to go to get there. So they need China on these particular issues. And so Trump is bringing it out and putting it on the table to say, look, we need to do some negotiating here because we need access, and China knows that. And I know what you know, what he knows, kind of thing, back and forth between these two as they're kind of setting the conditions. And so I think he was bringing it up because it is an important topic. And if they're more frank about it, I think the better. And that's why I think Trump led with that being one of the issues that they need to address.
Michael, that was one of the critical elements that we just talk about, center on the word diplomacy. Now let's talk about from the military perspective. Now keep in mind, last time you and we had the conversation, and we hoped that China could play a critical role when we look at the war in Ukraine. Now, at this moment, the war in Ukraine still takes place. And I guess at one point, the whole world, or even I would say larger percent of the countries, are going through what we call the fatigue. So in other words, we don't know what the war will come out, and meanwhile, Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, has not shown any sign of caving or giving up or even trying to make a compromise or negotiation with Ukraine. On the other hand, people are also paying attention to this China-Russia relationship, and some believe the growth of China's military capability could drive both countries, China and Russia, pursue more weapons and throwing more limits to Ukraine. So Michael, from your perspective, as you mentioned the word card, what card does China play when we look at the war in Ukraine, and how much are we going to expect that on June 9th in London, the second round of conversation, perhaps one way or another, this type of conversation or this type of content will be brought up to the table, because ultimately US has to be really cautious about China's presence and also about China's support to Russia at this moment. What do you think of that?
Well, if you look at what's happened in terms of the relationship regarding oil, of the fleet of 1,400 oil vessels that carry the oil that Russia's selling to its market. And about 70% of that market is in China and India alone. And so they represent a big part of the income. And why that's important, you just had the United States Senate vote 100-0 to sanction Russia on oil and to boost tariffs there. Against any nation that's buying that oil. Well, that has a direct implication for what goes on with China. So that's why that issue of oil and energy and that ghost fleet of 1,400 ships is going to be an issue because of the action of the U.S. Senate. Now, the House is going to echo that as well, probably in the next few days. Trump said this morning, actually, he probably said it yesterday, saying, "No, I'm not going to sign that bill because I think it's too difficult." Well, I think when he said that, he wasn't just talking about Russia and Ukraine. He was also, presaging the kind of conversation he knows he's going to have with China over the oil the sales from Russia. So, these are mixed players going on across the board now. And so I think we're going to see that. And yet Trump can't ignore when you have both the Senate and the House both unanimously agreeing for sanctions against Russia because they believe Russia has no reason to come to the table right now because the U.S. and the Europeans haven't taken enough steps to kind of put pressure on him. And after, of course, the whole sneak attack of hitting Russia's strategic bombers, that's another, and the bridges in Crimea, that's another conversation. But there's been a lot that's kind of tweaked Putin lately in ways that he wasn't quite prepared for, and and of course I forecasted he'd have that kind of reaction. It was strong, but it was also a measured response, and in returning bombs this weekend at Ukraine, but. In any case, I think it's an issue for the talks with China in London to talk about oil and to talk about energy. And this is also not an issue that'll go away in just resolving, for example, the Iranian issue. So because so much of Iranian oil goes to China, and China really needs that oil. Then there's the military issue regarding oil in China. So it's a complex situation on energy alone.
Michael, let's talk about another aspect. When we talk about the war in Ukraine, sitting U.S. President Donald Trump has been distanced himself away from the war. I mean, again, we're not talking about that Trump is going to walk away from these opportunities. But meanwhile, through social media, he has been calling the war in Ukraine has been Biden's war, or was Biden's war, Zelensky's war, Putin's war, but is never once Donald Trump's war. And in addition to that, and Donald Trump also mentioned and wrote on social media that if he were the president at the moment, Putin or Russia would never invade Ukraine at the first place. Dr. Patrick, again, you teach leadership. And you study leadership throughout your entire career as an educator. When we look at such rhetoric, and when we look at the messages embedded within the words, what type of leadership is that? Because some call it that Donald Trump is trying to find the excuses to shelter himself or to protect his reputation. But also people argue that Donald Trump is trying to use the social media or trying to use those words to buy more time in order to see a better peace deal or settle down between Ukraine and Russia. Regardless how many aspects we can see that, but the truth is the war still takes place and people are still hurting. How should we understand, or at this moment, to point fingers, Biden's war, Zelensky's war, Putin's war, just not Trump's war? What do you make of that?
Well, I think Trump is really trying to keep himself away from that kind of sticky wicket that he's gotten himself into, making kind of, brash declarations. The war will be over in the first day, that he was going to produce all these results. And that hasn't happened. Actually, the one thing that you've seen is the Europeans have started to get prepared for war and prepared to declare and to make some moves, and particularly regarding oil, Russian oil. So you're seeing what's happened is it's emboldened the Europeans. Now, one of the points I'll bring out that I think is particularly worth watching is the overwhelming discussion about what happened with the strategic bombers that Ukraine snuck up and tagged is kind of left out of the picture. You notice it hasn't stuck in there as an issue. Yet the bombers they hit were not the bombers that went after Ukraine. These were bombers that were in far away deployed areas that were more likely to go against other countries, such as the United States directly. And the belief that this thousands of miles distance to each of these locations was all orchestrated by Ukraine, as if no other intelligence agency in the world knew about it or had anything to do with it. that's a little that stretches credulity. I think certainly lots of people had some awareness that something was going on, but Putin, because of his way in which he operates, and that the people don't want to tell Putin things that he doesn't want to hear, and he's been having trouble with his generals and others on this issue lately. So the fact that Putin was surprised and taken aback by this is not good for Putin in terms of how the world sees it. But of course, the U.S. is disavowing any knowledge of your actions, as it were, about what Ukraine has done. But Ukraine is stepping up. Europe is stepping up. And but Putin feels I can outlast Trump. I can outlast the Europeans. Aren't going to bring enough to bear. And so he's doing what he thinks is best, which is taking the move, taking the fight to Ukraine, going after civilians. He's not backing off civilians at all. And so I don't think Trump gets out of this clean. I think he'd like to, but I don't think he does. And right now, he's under a lot of criticism for not stepping in and putting some pressure on. He could work with the Senate. He could work with the House. He could have support of the EU. But he's deciding not to do that yet at this point. And people are still wondering, what's he planned to do here? Because getting away from this sticky wicket is probably not one of them.
Michael, I got two more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about another crucial country to the U.S., which is South Korea. Recently, this nation successfully elected a brand new president. Now, during the victory speech, the new president vowed to heal the relationship between South Korea and North Korea. The reason why I bring up South Korea, mainly it's really about North Korea. Again, at this moment, Michael, you know that North Korea has been on the mind of China and the US and South Korea and Japan. I mean, again, so many countries are very concerned about this missile testing, nuclear weapon development. It's almost the same scenario as people are concerned about Iran at this moment. So from your perspective, again, this is only, again, bit over 100 days and for Donald Trump. What kind of message do you think that people are reading when we look at the U.S. and South Korea relationship at this moment? So in other words, how much do you believe that the world finally is getting used to the temperament or the pulse of the Trump administration? And also, before taping, remember you and I, we talk about this breakup between Elon Musk and Donald Trump. I mean, on social media, it's all over the place. So what kind of reputation, what kind of image does that fight send to the whole world when we see this firing exchange between Musk and Trump that alluded to international image? What do you think of that?
Well, when I think of North Korea, I think immediately of Xi Jinping being the person who's got the leash in his hand and will decide what North Korea does and what North Korea doesn't do. In my mind, he has the control. And so I think when I hear South Korea talking about improving relationships, what I'm hearing is that he will look to improve relationships with China, because in my mind, China is the shot caller here. And I'm not saying that we don't see lots of brash behavior. We do from North Korea. But I don't think I hope Trump keeps his nose out of that field as far as he can, although we're under the impression that America is likely to boost its presence. But the military presence in South Korea has a broader range of issues as to why the U.S. is likely to get back involved with South Korea because of what's going on with Australia and Japan and other countries that are beefing up their positions in that whole region. But again, the player, this is China's backyard. The person to listen to about what's going to happen in South Korea or anywhere else in that region is paying attention to what Xi Jinping is saying and comparing it to the boost of U.S. presence in places like the Philippines and throughout that region.
Well, Michael, I want to wrap up our conversation again, going back to this upcoming meeting between US and China in London on June 9th. And of course, as we mentioned before, it's crucial, it's so important. Now, another perspective that we have to talk about, again, mainstream media that tend to ignore, it's we want to talk about the territorial dispute. Of course, that's Taiwan. I mean, again, every time when the officials, when they meet from the US, from China, Taiwan will be brought up one way or another. We know that from the Chinese perspective, or from our perspective, that Taiwan has been solely part of China. It's no longer a territorial dispute. But meanwhile, Taiwanese government is very anxious about the relationship between Taiwan and US at this moment. So from your perspective, Michael, how do you think that both sides are able to smooth out the talk on Taiwan, or is it still relevant and critical to better up, or even say to improve the relationship for US and China at this moment about Taiwan?
Well, I'm very interested to hear. I don't think it'll get a lot of attention, a lot of focus. In fact, if they're going to set something aside, that may be what they set aside for this particular meeting. I think they're going to be geared up to deal with, probably dealing a little bit with the energy issue, but this is going to be with tariffs and with what does China get for its rare earth kinds of negotiations. I think they're going to have to narrow that field of what they talk about in this meeting. But certainly in the background is Taiwan and how that's dealt with. And you have to really unpack not only what's happening in China regarding that, but also what's happening in the whole Eastern theater in terms of the United States and its role with Australia and other nations in that area. So that's a separate issue. I think it could come up, but probably not in this meeting because of Pete Hegseth's recent comments on Taiwan. So it's a live issue. It's not a back burner issue. It's a live issue, but probably not in this meeting. What's your take on the current situation in Taiwan? What do you see here as pivotal for the U.S. and China on this issue?
Well, Michael, to be honest, based on the information that I gathered, I have three aspects to share with you. And number one, if we look at the ongoing political and economic competition between US and China, as you mentioned before, I agree with you. Taiwan is a critical issue, but it's not the most important one on the agenda. So in other words, for both countries, especially from the Chinese perspective, it's more critical, it's even more, I would say, indispensable for both countries to understand that the world needs the two largest countries to work together on this economic level. So in other words, when we see two powers, the strong powers are in fight, it could hurt a lot. Especially we look at the countries in Southeast Asia, we look at the countries who are less developed. So number one, the economy is so important. And number two, as you and I will agree, we talked before, both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump are unconventional players. So in other words, we call them disruptors, or call them interrupters, etc. But it's one thing that we need to understand. Xi Jinping is dealing with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is well known as the businessman. And Donald Trump is dealing with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is known as a game changer. So in other words, Taiwan is an issue, but at this moment, both parties will play the card smartly and wisely, because the goal is to keep the conversation going, is not to shun the other party out. So that's a second thing. And the last but not least, from the Chinese perspective, Taiwan is one of the most indisputable issue for Chinese and also for the national interest. So in other words, solely believe that US, let's focus on our mutual interest, not to get distracted. Again, this is, especially the last point, it's all diplomatic, sounds like a diplomatic talk, but in reality, let's focus on the bigger picture and let's not get distracted by the insignificant or unnecessary noises, not signals, noises to ruin the relationship or to stop the progress that both countries are making, if I'm saying making sense.
Absolutely. I think you're right. They're going to focus on what is timely right now, and that's the tariff issues. It's important to both countries. I expect that's the dominance of the conversation. Oil may come up in it because they're in London, and
That's
the
right.
EU is paying attention with its rules in the House and the Senate both. But I think that's the tariff issue is the issue right now.
That's right. And also, another thing is during the conversation, President Trump also had invited President Xi Jinping and also his spouse to visit the US. And of course, President Xi Jinping did the same thing. So again, I believe that on June 9th, this conversation will be fruitful and productive. But one thing we have to understand, it all starts from the conversation on tariffs, on trade policy, but both countries cannot or should not afford to let any other unnecessary noises to stop the progress. We're not dealing with, immature children. We're actually dealing with the matters that could greatly affect the whole world. So again, there's a lot more to be seen as after the trade talk or after the conversation on June 9th. Well, Michael, it's always been a pleasure to speak to you. And again, thank you so much for your time and insights. Again, I'm sorry that in this episode, we don't have time to get into this immaturity and the fire exchange between Donald Trump and Elon Musk. And surely that will never appear on this show. But we can definitely continue to see what will happen next. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to hearing more of your comments on some of these issues that we've only just started on. So I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.